Well, I'm delighted to be here this morning. I always love coming to beautiful Frisco. And finally the sun's out and here we are inside. So we'll make this part quick and certainly want to open up discussion and questions and whatever you'd like to hear me talk about or make sure that I'm paying attention to as my constituents here in Summit County. One of the reasons we chose this gorgeous space today is maybe 3 weeks ago, Governor Hickenlooper was here, and this was the space that was identified for the bill signing for the mobile learning labs. And I was just so impressed with the space and the work that's going on here at Elevate CoSpace that I wanted to come back. And I don't know what you think, but it's a pretty warm and welcoming environment. You can see why people would want to rent space here and choose to work here collaboratively. And we do have coffee and some treats over here, so please feel free to make yourself comfortable and grab something. As Beverly was saying, Beverly and Teek Simonton, who's the county clerk in Eagle County, spent so much time at the Capitol this session advocating for elected official salaries that people started to think that they were either in the House or the Senate. If they were in the House, they thought they were senators. If they were in the Senate, they thought, well, they must work in the House of Representatives. But talk about Tiger. I mean, Bev Breakstone was amazing, advocating for all of the elected officials at the county level. And just incredible. I can't believe she didn't give up on that effort. Because how many times had you been defeated with at least 2 or 3 times?
Previous times, yes.
2 previous times.
Yes.
And as you came in, I hope you had a chance to sign in and grab my little end of session overview. If not, I forgot also to introduce my aide this past session. Stuart Jenkins is right here. Yay, Stuart. And maybe Stuart can make sure that you all get a copy of the handout. But Stuart worked closely with me this past session. Right now he's working at the Aspen Institute, and I'm hoping he comes back to work with me next session. We'll see how that goes. But at any rate, you'll see an overview of some of the work that I was involved in. One of the bills that we were just talking about doesn't show up on my end of session overview because we kind of keep it on the down low. I don't know how you talk about increasing elected official salaries without making it look like you're self-serving, right? And so when Beverly and I first started looking at this issue, the way our state constitution is written, elected officials at the county level cannot get an increase in pay unless the General Assembly takes action. And because the General Assembly was so afraid to take action for fear of making it look like they were self-serving and giving elected officials raises, they didn't take action for the last 2 years. So I shared Beverly's frustration with that, and so I said, you know what, I'll carry that bill. And I'll work on that. I'll even start it in the House. And unfortunately, it took so long to gather up the right amount of support and get the bill drafted in a way that we had the kind of support that it didn't pass until the second to last day of the legislative session this year. And it's a story about how politics works. And my interest really was only in the elected officials at the county level. But as we worked through this process, we learned that if I started the bill in the House and sent it over to the Senate with just the county elected official salaries in it, the Senate was going to kill the bill. Just right out, just straight up, just like that. So in going through the process, we learned that the Senate would be more apt to pass the bill and the governor would be more apt to sign the bill if we dealt with not only the county elected officials, but also the state elected officials and the General Assembly, all of whom will not even see an increase for how many years?
Till 2019.
Till 2019 with the bill passing.
And the governor is paid number 47 out of 50 states.
And the governor's pay is 47th out of 50th in the nation. Yes. That's how difficult getting this kind of work done is, okay? And I just want to make it perfectly clear that I will never benefit from an increase in pay as a result of this legislation passing. So it was just really
Is that because anybody who votes for it cannot get any benefit, right?
Well,
Millie,
future
limited by 2000.
That's
well,
what I'm saying, yeah, future elections.
yes, it's for future. Yes, it's for future elected officials. The salary increase is for nobody who's currently holding office. There are some folks who, if they do win re-election, would benefit, but that's not till 4 years. So I should start by saying, as you all know, I live in Summit County. I live in the Summit Cove neighborhood, and when I first started my career in the legislature, I was retiring as the superintendent, and some of you came to me and said, "You're not ready to retire from public service." Dan Gibbs might remember that conversation. And so I started in the legislature in 2010, and then was reelected in 2012 and in 2014. So I'm in my 3rd term, and I can only have 1 more term. So next November, when I run again, which I intend to do, will be my last term. So because we have term limits in Colorado, 8 years. So I say that, this looks like a group of friends. So I say that so you can say, oh, she only has 1 more term. But I also tell it to people when they say if they are tired of me, you only have me possibly for 1 more term. So I will never benefit from the elected official salary increase. But Beverly and Teak did just an incredible job, and I've gotten thank you notes from all over the state. I've never received so much appreciation for the work I've done than I have from county and state elected officials, so it's pretty special. So thank you again. I'm so relieved that we got that done. And we will get a picture with the governor. Okay.
We wanted to keep it so low-key, there was no official. So we want to photo with
Yeah, so low-key that it doesn't show up on my end of session update, even though I'm really proud of the work I did with that. And it was bipartisan. Senator Baumgartner, who represents Summit, was the Senate sponsor. And I do have to just tell one more story, and it's not about Randy, but he did work really well together with me on that bill. But as we were trying to figure out whether or not we had the votes to pass the bill, we actually have little sheets that have everybody's name, and I'll actually go around to everyone and I'll say, Kevin, are you good with the elected official salary bill? Because if people are in tough seats, because quite honestly, when I run again next November, somebody's going to say you shouldn't vote for Millie Hamner because she carried the bill to increase elected official salaries, right? So people who are in difficult seats didn't want to have their name on that kind of legislation. So I actually had to go around, talk to every one of my colleagues, go down the other side of the aisle, talk to all the Republicans, and it was close. And we needed 33 votes to get the bill passed in the House. And at the 11th hour, as we were about to finalize that work, we heard that some of the Republicans in the House were nervous and wanted to carry amendments to eliminate the General Assembly increase from the bill, which I knew would then mean it would die in the Senate or the governor wouldn't sign it. So at the 11th hour, and my desk is on the floor on the end of the aisle, I looked up, and towering over me was the Senate President, Cadman, who's a Republican. And he said, I hear you're having some trouble with the House Republicans. So I stood up, and I'm still a little shorter than he is. And he said, who do I need to talk to? And he did. And we pulled it off, and we had 33 votes.
That's right.
Okay, so I didn't mean to spend the whole time talking about that, but you know what happens in the legislature, and you learn how it works by some of these stories. And I've learned how it works, working now my 5th year in the session. But, it's just really important to have good relationships with people to be able to get that work done. And if you do look at my legislative session overview, it's funny, this doesn't reflect the number of bills I carried. As I look back, because I'm now a member of the Joint Budget Committee, we carry a lot of bills. In my entire career up to this point, I believe I carried 40 bills successfully. In this year, I carried 40 bills successfully in 1 year. So, it took 4 years for 40 bills, and now this year, 1 year for 40 bills.
Representative Hamner was actually the member legislator with the most bills carried this session.
I didn't realize that, Stuart. Stuart said I'm the representative with the most bills carried this session. Wow.
Out of the Senate and the House.
Wow, I knew I was busy, but I didn't know, no wonder I was so busy. And, as I said, I was just appointed to be the vice chair of the Budget Committee next year as part of this term. The way it works is the Senate leadership chairs the Joint Budget Committee, and then it flips to the House. So next year it's the House's turn. So next year I actually be the chair of the Joint Budget Committee, which is considered to be the most prestigious, or I don't know, powerful. I never really think about it that way. And Elmer, who's here, his daughter-in-law is one of the Joint Budget Committee staff members, one of the best, Carolyn Campman, and she is just awesome. So I just always love seeing Elmer, and when I see Caroline, I can't help but think, yeah, please. I've told her that to her face, too. So I'm sorry, Andrew, did you? I did it? Oh. Okay, I'll just move on. Okay, so anyway, part of one thing I was going to say about this overview and the bills I carried, every bill I carried had a Republican co-sponsor, or I think there's only one or two that didn't have a Republican co-sponsor, had Republican votes, yes. And it's one of the things that I've learned in working in the legislature, to find moderate Republicans. I mean, if they're extreme, I probably won't reach out to them, just like I don't work very well with some of the extreme Democrats. I try to find that moderate, seriously. I mean, that's where it really works best. And the Joint Budget Committee work, because of the dynamics in the state legislature, the Democrats have the majority in the House, and the Republicans have the majority in the Senate. So if a bill comes out of the House with just Democrat support, what do you think will happen to it in the Senate? It will die. And what will happen to a bill that starts in the Senate that only has Republican support and comes to the House? It will die. And we have examples of bills like that happened in the legislature this year. For example, some of the bills that came out of the Senate that died in the House, there were some more discussions around personhood and restricting women's rights. Those died in the House. In the House, there was some legislation, for example, that would have restricted corporate tax loopholes. They died in the Senate. So bills that are strictly partisan, kind of, and that kind of divide the aisle, will probably not pass in this legislature. So the Joint Budget Committee, because of the dynamics in the House and the Chamber with the majority being split, the Joint Budget Committee is equally split. So the Senate has 2 Republican senators, and the House has 2 Republican representatives. So there's an equal 3-3 of Republicans and Democrats in the Joint Budget Committee. And it takes 4-2 to win an argument or to make a decision on the Joint Budget Committee. So if all the Democrats say yes and all the Republicans vote no, nothing happens. Right? That only happened twice the entire year during this legislative session, where the Joint Budget Committee couldn't quite agree on some issues. Just twice. Well, one of them was the driver's license program for undocumented citizens. As you can imagine, that's a tough issue. The recommendation that came to us from the Joint Budget Committee staff was that the Department of Revenue needed more authority to use their cash funds because the program was more successful than we had anticipated. And there was a perception that if we did that, we'd be expanding the program. So it became a pretty difficult issue, but we even reached compromise on that issue. The other issue that I remembered had to do with background checks for concealed carry permits. So there were only just a couple issues like that. In fact, the Joint Budget Committee and the Colorado Statesman, which is a news release that's released, I believe, weekly at the Capitol, the Joint Budget Committee was identified as being the most effective committee, or when they were reflecting on effectiveness during the legislative session, they identified 4 individuals, but they also recognized the entire Joint Budget Committee as being effective in getting the kind of work done. That's how well we work together. Good relationships, respect for each other, and bipartisanship. So that's what you see reflected in all the bills that I carried. The overview shows some of the major accomplishments we made with the budget. Next year, with being the chair of the Budget Committee, I'm going to be faced with a budget crisis. So I'm going to need all of your help and support working through these issues. We're in a situation right now where the state budget has hit the Tabor cap. And those of you who are familiar with Tabor will understand what I'm talking about. But this provision of Tabor actually limits the amount of money, limits the revenue that the state is allowed to spend. And so we've hit that cap that we set through referendum C that we a few years back. We lifted it with referendum C. We've hit that cap. And it presents quite a challenge for us because it means that we'll need to be refunding small checks to taxpayers at a time when we still need major infrastructure work with transportation. You can see we were able to fund education by about $200 million. That doesn't make much of a difference in what they call the negative factor. So we still have major issues with funding K-12 education and higher education. We have increasing needs for Medicaid. We have increasing prison populations. So we have a lot of fixed costs, and now we're being driven up to this cap where we're issuing refunds. So it's going to be quite the challenge to figure out how to meet the needs and meet the obligations that we have in the state budget while also issuing TABOR refunds. Yeah.
Did you propose something, a referendum, so that those marijuana
Yes.
taxes could be not refunded?
Yes, one of the bills I carried, House Bill 1367, the question was around marijuana tax refunds. And the marijuana tax TABOR refund issue is different than the general fund budget TABOR tax refund issue. They're separate issues. But House Bill 1367 passed, and so next November on the ballot, you'll see a question as a result of that, which will once again ask the voters if they will let us keep the recreational marijuana tax revenue. There was a little glitch in the Blue Book for Proposition AA, and we underestimated in the Blue Book the amount of revenue that would be coming into Welcome, the state budget. And because of that, we either have to issue refunds or ask people if we can keep the revenue. One more time, so this will be the third time we'll have a recreational marijuana issue on the ballot. The first one was, did Colorado want it to be legal? And they said overwhelmingly yes. The next time it was like, can we tax it to regulate the program and create education programs? They said yes. Now we have to ask them, oops, we underestimated this TABOR issue, and would you let us keep the money, please?
Tax credit or the check or whatever, however you handle it, wouldn't be something like $10 or less?
Well, with
Goes to each citizen?
Bev's asking about the refund for the Proposition AA tax revenue. Actually, the way we worded House Bill 1367, I work very closely with Senator Stedman on these issues because he's way more knowledgeable about these issues than I am. This was my very first marijuana bill. People said, why are you carrying a marijuana bill? I said, well, it has to do with taxes, and I'm the Joint Budget Committee. But the way the refund structure is that a part of the refund would go to the retailers.
Okay.
And part of the refund would go in general to the taxpayers because they've approved the tax, and it'd be very small. Well, hopefully we'll get their support on the ballot measure. Thank you, Andrew. Well, and Brad's trying to film this in case people want to catch this who weren't able to come, so I'll try to synthesize Andrew's comments. Basically that in an election year with a marijuana question, the voter turnout will be there. So for Democrats. So hopefully we can, because there really won't be revenue spent on promoting the measure, so hopefully we can get through word of mouth and other ways the importance of passing that measure when they see it on the ballot. Yeah, go ahead.
What was the legislature negative that proposal that came out by Governor Hickenlooper about using the hospital fee and not putting it into the general fund?
Okay.
It would have to be returned.
Thank you, Karina. Karina's asking about why was there negativity in the legislature about using what's called the hospital provider fee to impact the TABOR refund issue. And it gets kind of complicated, as you can imagine. And remember I said we're hitting the TABOR cap. Well, all revenue, including cash fees that come into the state budget, count towards the TABOR cap, including severance tax and including this fee that's called the hospital provider fee. And it's actually a fee that hospitals pay. It goes into the state budget, and the state budget uses those dollars to match, and well, not necessarily match, but to leverage federal funds, okay? Then we send those dollars back to the hospitals to cover costs that they have for Medicaid clients and people that don't have, the funds to cover their costs, to help the hospitals break even, quite honestly. So right now that hospital provider fee comes into the state budget and counts towards the Tabor cap, right? And so that and severance taxes being higher than we anticipated have rushed us to this cap level. So the solution that was being debated quietly for a while and then became public in the legislature toward the last week or so of session would have been, can we exempt the hospital provider fee from the Tabor cap limit? So there was discussion about that, Republicans, Democrats, we couldn't quite reach agreement, and it didn't pass. So that conversation will come up again next year. I don't know whether, I believe we can accomplish it legislatively rather than having to go to a vote of the people, but it could be that we have to go to a vote of the people to get clarification through Tabor about whether or not we're allowed to determine that the hospital provider fee is what we would call an enterprise and be exempt. It would have put off the Tabor refund issue for about 5 years, we expect.
You're just paying that money out, it makes sense.
Yes.
Just taking it.
Well, an example like that and where the idea came from is right now our higher education student tuition does not count towards the Tabor cap. It's considered an enterprise. It's kind of a special something set aside that is an enterprise, and we don't count that. So the concept was, can we consider the hospital provider fee, just like higher education tuition, as an enterprise exempt from the Tabor cap?
And am I correct in assuming that the reason why you probably got opposition to this is because there's a fear that Tabor keeps causing, it's always going to be an issue in the state, and we can't get that Tabor amendment undone. So there's a fear that if we keep getting these exemptions, that eventually Tabor's going to become, which is probably a good thing, it would become kind of non-existent and irrelevant. And I think that there are legislators that are in fear that they like Tabor. There's conservative legislators that like Tabor.
So, Linda's point is how the controversy around Tabor itself, and is this the camel's nose under the tent, and then do we lose all of it? So I'm trying to summarize in a short way.
Yeah.
But thank you, very well said. Thank you. And welcome those of you who are just joining us. Thank you for coming, and we do have coffee and refreshments over here. Where was I? Oh, so I was just doing kind of an overview of our budget, where we are, some of the challenges, some of the successes. Probably the other hottest issue this entire legislative session was around student testing. One of the hottest issues. So as most of you know, I was the chair of the Education Committee for the last 2 years, and you all know I was the superintendent of schools here in Summit County. And so as soon as I finished with the budget, which was no easy feat, I mean, it was a $25 billion budget that we had to reach bipartisan agreement on the Budget Committee, and then turn over to the Legislature. And as a member of the Budget Committee, I had to explain every single item to the Legislature, and they had the chance to debate it and add amendments and say, well, I don't think you should spend it like that, you should do it like that. And so going through that whole process, and it passed. I'm like, whew, now I can kick back and enjoy the glory, the Legislature. Oh, no. I was asked to step up and fill in for John Buckner on the Education Committee. He had been assigned the chair of the Education Committee and was dealing with health issues. And quite sadly, I attended his memorial service yesterday, saw Linda there. He didn't make it. And it's really very tragic. But I did step in on the Education Committee as the vice chair with chairperson Brittany Pedersen, and was handed the student testing issue. Like, oh, thank you very much for that. And so I said, well, who's been at the table? Well, nobody was at the table. And the work had just been spinning, and people were getting more and more upset, and people were getting more entrenched in their positions. And the positions were really get rid of all testing and the Common Core standards, keep everything the way it is. And they were that locked in and that extreme. And so I had to step in. The first thing I did was start bringing people to the table. So bringing people to the table means trying to find meeting time outside of all the other meetings that I'm involved in and outside of being on the floor, doing all the floor work. And when people were very entrenched, very emotional, very passionate, but the work happened. The bill that you see summarized here is Senate Bill 257 that had my name on it. There was also a House bill that had John Buckner's name on it in the Senate, and I wanted John Buckner's name on that bill, and so that's the one that passed, because I knew how hard he had worked on those issues. So the very last day of session, we passed a bill that significantly reduced student testing time in the state of Colorado. In fact, by the time a student starts in kindergarten and graduates from high school now in Colorado, there are 40 hours less of student testing. And we'd really kind of gone way overboard with, you know, there's certainly we want to make sure that kids are doing well in school and are learning the standards and we're holding everyone accountable. That we are making sure that our most vulnerable kids are learning and not being, you know, left behind. But we were doing it with way too many hours spent on testing and test prep, and then districts felt like they had to put in their own assessment system to make sure their kids were ready for the real test, and it was just, whew, pretty crazy. So meanwhile, we were all patting ourselves on the back that we reached agreement and had bipartisan support, and we knew the governor was going to support the bill. Out in the field, the people are very underwhelmed. They don't think we did, they liked the testing the way it was, or they thought we should have gone farther. So that's the nature of the work in the legislature, right? You just can't please everybody, but you work really hard to try to find compromise. So that's really all I wanted to highlight.
We've got to talk about the I-70 bill, because that.
Oh, okay. Do I have to?
You got Dan back here,
Dan
so.
to help.
Okay, Dan will have my back on this one. Dan serves on the I-70 Coalition, and I believe we have a meeting coming up. I plan to attend that meeting to make sure I'm up to speed. I know there's at least one person here in the room who's frustrated with delays on I-70 and construction. How many of us are frustrated with I-70 construction? Okay, yeah. It's,
We're very glad it's happening, but it's a mess while it's happening.
you're glad it's happening, but it is a mess and it's frustrating. And there is an email update you can sign up for to get regular updates. And I'm going to put that in my newsletter, or Stuart can help me track that down for you. So you can get regular updates via email about what's happening on I-70, so you can maybe plan your trips around that. But what Beverly is talking about is there was a bill that was introduced. It came from work we started doing last summer around how can we improve safety and reduce congestion, reduce the amount of time I-70 is closed during the winter months. And there was a lot of conversation about that, involved the truckers, you know, and the motor carriers and the towns and counties affected along I-70. And one of the solutions that was offered up was to increase traction on tires for passenger vehicles. Because what we found out by looking at some of the data, that more often than not, it was a passenger vehicle without the proper snow tires or bald tires that was spinning out, causing a truck to jackknife, closing I-70 for hours. And as you can imagine, that's just a mess. CDOT tries so hard to keep I-70 open, but how much control do they have over a passenger vehicle and a passenger, you know, driver's decision about what kind of tires to use to come up to the mountains and go home? So the bill would have required better traction devices, either chains or adequate snow tires. I think we increased the depth of the tread that was required, increased the fine for not having the appropriate traction. And the bill going through the process, and I don't know what you wanted me to say about it because I have to be politically correct, you know, ran into some trouble in the Senate. Dan knows how the Senate is. The House does such great work, and then we send our work over to the Senate, and there were problems in the Senate. It actually got reduced and amended into being just a study of the problem on I-70. I'm like, really? There have been so many studies, but you know, to the Senate's credit, the bill is alive. I mean, we're still in some fashion. It actually ended up in conference committee. It was Diane Mitch Bush, who represents Eagle County and Routt County, who carried the bill with Representative Rankin, who's a Republican from Garfield County. But I was called in to be on the conference committee to help resolve the differences between the House and the Senate. And the best we really could do was ending up with the study. So hopefully we'll be able to study this issue again and come up totally. So we're brainstorming, and sorry, Brad, back to the viewers. I don't know how you want to pay attention to all of those side conversations, but I think it's around frustrations around how to improve safety on I-70. Why didn't that bill pass? And Mark's question about, was it about the cost? One of the arguments against the bill, it wasn't necessarily about the cost to the consumer, but it was around people's rights, and that we were infringing on their right. So that was a real interesting argument. But then our conversation here also shifted to what about truck traffic? Can we limit that? And the conversation was around, I-70 is a national interstate where truckers are trying to get through the state. Those conversations have come up before. The truckers have looked at if we did, and CDOT did recommend that, some partial delays for truckers until they could, for example, clear the interstate. I believe that they do have the authority right now to restrict travel if they're trying to clean things up at Vail Pass, for example, or at the tunnel. Oh, yeah. The problem becomes if we do it on a regular basis, where are they going to wait? They're on deadlines. They're trying to get, goods and services, gasoline, and they support our small businesses and our large businesses and our resort industry. So it gets a little complicated, but we're not going to give up. And Dan is on the I-70 Coalition. I'm going to their next meeting. I look forward to getting caught up to speed with some of the ideas that you all have and we have. But did my appointment to the JBC impact my ability to get bills passed, help me or hinder me? Oh, are you kidding me? I was explaining how, Dave, in the last 2 years, I carried a total of 40 bills successfully. In this one session, I carried 40 bills successfully. So what happens, the Budget Committee bills, because they're bipartisan, and that's one of the reasons why, because the Budget Committee is 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. I like to have Republican co-prime sponsors on bills, not only because it ensures greater likelihood of success, but also it decreases the amount of debate and argument over bills. It really does. So it makes it a little easier if you have a bipartisan good idea bill in order to get it passed. But I will tell you, I was exhausted at the end of the session. I worked really, really hard. I mean, the JBC is like a full-time position. I mean, we have meetings that we begin work in November. The legislature convenes in January. The JBC starts and meets every day in November, 9 to 5, every day in December, 9 to 5. So it's like a real job, right? Without extra pay. And then we start up again in January, and we meet at the end of the work every day of the session. So instead of just having a committee meeting every other day or a couple times a week, there's a committee meeting every day. So it's a huge commitment. So a lot of the work that I did, I either had to get done early on before things got too intense with JBC, or after the JBC had completed the budget work. So I worked hard this session.
We appreciate it.
Thank you. It's fun. It's really exciting work. I really enjoy it, and I appreciate all of you being here today. I want us to stop maybe and I know that Beverly wanted to introduce someone else.